Right, hello. This is one thing I've been wanting to actually expose for a while now, for actually many years, but not being sure how to go about it. We've been lied to about Nelson Mandela and his wife, Winnie Mandela, and that whole thing. So let's get into it. And we will find out stuff.
You want to see some magic? How about some Mandela magic?
Just have a look at this graph. Unemployment. Yeah. This is the Rainbow Nation. Yeah.
Want to see some more Mandela magic?
And that's what happens when they actually riot. They destroy shopping malls. They break in and just take everything. It's fantastic, eh? 66.7 of the population live in poverty. It's wonderful.
I'm a South African, and I'm going to be quite frank. I'd like to tell you all about Nelson Mandela, the international statesman and hero who single-handedly caused the end of apartheid and led South Africa to the bright rainbow nation future
Unicorns
that
and
doesn't
bunnies.
exist.
Look at that.
Having grown up during the abolishment of apartheid and during the height of the Mandela craze, I've always wondered why people so unquestionably just accept this idea that Mandela was a great man without looking at the fact that, well, he kind of wasn't. So let's discuss Nelson Mandela today. Let's not discuss the international statesman, the international hero. Let's discuss Mandela, the terrorist communist, and what he did to South Africa. Let's ease into this with this video of Nelson Mandela singing about killing all the white people and shooting them with AK-47s and blowing them up with bazookas.
And next to him is a white person. They had no plan for peace. None whatsoever. They wanted every white person dead. But yet, Monday morning, they will go to work for the white man to actually get money.
No, I'm not making that up, it's real. Here he is with the Umkhonto weSizwe, which is the militant arm of the ANC that he created himself. We're going to talk about that later because it's very pivotal to this video. He's standing next to a very well-known member, very influential member of the South African Communist Party, Ronnie Kasrils. And they're singing, and I'm going to tell you exactly the lyrics of the song. It goes like this. We members of Umkhonto, this is that militant group, are prepared to kill all the Boers. We all know Boers are white people in South Africa, the white farmer. Get on the roof and tell them that when I hit the Boer, my mother becomes happy. Whites and Boers are troubling our parents at home. We're going to hit them with our AK-47s and bazookas. So, you know, this is after Nelson Mandela had been released from prison. This is after apartheid was already over. It's before he took over as president. But there he is singing about killing all the white people. Maybe you weren't expecting that, but you know what's more ridiculous than blowing people up with bazookas and AK-47s based on the color of their skin? A data broker rap. Deep within the corporate offices of a data broker.
Oh gosh, Ed.
Something is find out your personal details, and Incogni can help keep you a terrorist watch list in 2008. Now, he was on that list for a reason. You see, back in 1961, him and a very well-known communist. This white guy that you see over here, his name is Joe Slovo. He's actually from the Soviet Union, ended up in South Africa, and was the leader of the South African.
Okay, so I think that part I should actually explain. The USA only removed Mandela off the terror watch list in 2008.
African Communist Party. Him, Walter Sisulu, and Nelson Mandela started an organization called Umkhonto weSizwe, which means the spear of the nation. And this was the militant arm of the ANC. Basically a guerrilla group that was there to cause terror, a terrorist group. And they started by blowing up infrastructure with bombs, targeting things like power stations and transformers, railway lines, train stations. But, of course, they didn't stop there. Just like every other communist terrorist organization, they went after civilians next, soft targets. And this included, of course, shopping centers, bars, sports stadiums, crowded public areas like Church Street. They even bombed a chain of fast food restaurants. Not only that, though, of course, they laid anti-tank mines in rural areas so that farm workers and children would walk on them and blow themselves up. We're not talking about a good group of people here. In fact, they were absolutely horrible. And they acted on their own discretion. So they were kind of told, do whatever you have to do to destabilize the apartheid-led government. And so they...
And also, what Nelson did, when there were normal South Africans around him, he would say one thing. When there were only his kind around him, he would say something completely different. That's a commie for you.
They went and did it. And this included all sorts of nasty things that they did to people. Torture, necklacing, which we'll get to, and a whole lot of wacky stuff.
Demonic
and this,
behavior.
Of course, was Nelson Mandela's creation. And is the reason why he was locked up in jail. You see, before he was locked up, he went abroad to go and train with, in Libya and various other sympathetic communist states.
And don't you find that totally hypocritical? There were some white farmers that went to the USA last year to go and tell Mr. Trump what was happening in South Africa. They came back and these people got accused of terrible things. How dare you go overseas and say what is happening in South Africa? They did it, but were there really such bad things happening in South Africa to the normal black man? Because these guys were not the normal black man. They were training to become communists, to actually overthrow the South African government.
And during this time, of course, he was a member of the South African Communist Party Central Committee. So everyone knows him as, Mandela, leader of the ANC. But at the same time, he was a communist and part of the Communist Party. And him, along with this the very typical Marxist sort of tear down capitalism and tear down the systems and burn it all to the ground sort of communist Joe Slovo, they were, of course, training with all the bad communists out there. And when he came back to South Africa to try and implement some of these terroristic things he learned abroad, he was arrested. And he admitted to, I think it was, this is Nelson Mandela, admitted to something like 193 acts of sabotage and was put in prison. But now remember, a man in prison is still a leader. And during the time that he was in prison, his party, and specifically his wife at the time, were all about terrorizing the country. And you know, everybody looks at it from a point of view that here the ANC, they were attacking the apartheid government and they were, you know, fighting, what would you call it, a revolutionary war. They wanted to overthrow an unfair system. And you could just...
And funnily enough, they are still fighting. I'm telling you, things that happened 30, 40 years ago, they are still fighting it. It's like you actually locked up in a cage, but you don't realize that the cage doors open.
Justify that. There are plenty of ways you can justify fighting against a corrupt, immoral system, and you want to overturn it because it's unfair and all that. And fair play. I mean, if you want to go down that route, I won't argue with you. However, what most people don't talk about is what the ANC was doing, and Umkhonto we Sizwe, this group that Mandela formed, were doing in the townships. So what are townships? Well, it's kind of interesting. In South Africa, before World War II, the majority of the black population used to live in hostels and servants' quarters, as they were called. And, you know, that's just like it sounds. People that were working in the cities and working for companies and so on, if you were black, there were houses that were built for you, sort of like apartment blocks, things like that you would live in. But after the war, 1948, the Nationalist Party took over. Sorry if I'm boring you with this South African history, but the Nationalist Party, they're the bad guys, you know, they're the apartheid guys. They took over and they put into law this kind of land reform thing where it's certain pieces of land are for black people, certain pieces of land are for white people, and black businesses have certain land, white people, that type of thing. And so what happened is there was this massive urbanization, of course, of all the sort of the black people coming to the cities, the white cities, to come and work. And of course, they weren't allowed to live in those areas, so they had to go to the black-owned areas, and they started to build.
And just note, where the black people had their own land, the blacks weren't able to build anything. So they came to the white places.
Build these townships, which were basically a big community, a mixture of real houses and shacks, you know, sort of a shanty town, I guess similar to a Brazilian favela, something like that. And in fact, This place, I was there 2 years ago. And because I was there 2 years ago, I'm sure it looks worse now than then. Just show you on the screen now what I'm talking about so you can see what they look like and what they still look like today. They haven't changed. In fact, they've probably gotten worse, to be honest, as far as the way they look. But these places are highly unregulated, so they weren't really under the control of the apartheid government and the apartheid police. You know, they weren't a place that they would go into simply because they're too dangerous and uncontrolled. And they weren't regulated at all, really. So just this is where the majority of the black people used to live. Now, the things that the ANC and the Umkhonto we Sizwe used to get up to inside of these townships is something that for some reason people just don't discuss. So this is Nelson Mandela's militant group. They used to necklace people. And if you don't know what necklacing is, it's probably one of the cruelest, most barbaric things you could ever do to a person. And what it involves is you take an old tire, an old car tire, you fill it with petrol. Well, first, you catch someone, you beat them up and you tie them up. You put a car tire around their neck, fill it with petrol and set it alight so that they burn to death in the most horrific way imaginable with molten rubber, and you see them running around and rolling around as they burn to death in absolute agony. And I've actually seen personally with my own eyes the aftermath of a necklacing. Of course, I've seen footage. It used to be on the news a lot when I was growing up of actual necklacing taking place. Don't know why that was uncensored, but for whatever reason, I used to see it a lot on TV.
In June 1986, South Africans watched in horror as a woman got burned to death on television. Maki Skosana's very public necklacing started a whole new trend. But few people know about the events which led to this killing frenzy in Duduza on the East Rand.
But I've seen personally with my own eyes, there was a township near where I used to live, and they'd necklaced someone, and I drove past and saw the aftermath. Absolutely horrific.
Paraffin is easy to catch fire. It's flammable. If I put it on the tire is what? It's catching fire.
And you'll put this on the person.
And while we are beating you, you are very weak. I get it. You can't fight back. Even though even I can take this tire, and took it to like this, you are very weak.
And this was the ANC's.
And this is what I cannot understand, what people don't seem to get. Not everybody is the same. Do you really want to live next door to this? Really?
Mkhonto Sizwe's main weapon of terrorism, and something that they would do to the black populace within the townships. This is not something they would do to the white people. They would bomb the white infrastructure and bomb the police stations and bomb the power stations, all that kind of stuff, and then started bombing, like I said, bars and sports stadiums and shopping centers and that type of thing. They would bomb. That's what they would do to the white people. But the black people inside of the townships, they'd burn them to death in excruciating, barbaric manner. And the thing is, officially, the ANC said, I believe the leader of the ANC at the time, I think it was Oliver Tambo, he said that although they don't condone necklacing, they understand where it comes from. I'm paraphrasing, I'm pretty sure, but basically they acted with ambivalence. They just, officially to the outside world made it look like they didn't like it, but actually they were carrying it out. And proof of this is that Nelson Mandela's wife, Winnie Mandela, who was basically calling the shots on his behalf while he was in prison, came out publicly in 1986 and said, and I'm going to have to find the quote because I don't want to misquote this harpy. She's a terrible person, by the way. Let's see. I'm trying to find out what she said. I did write it down just because I knew I'd have to say it. This was Winnie Mandela's words. She said this in 1986. And I remember, I was 6 years old at the time. I was a tiny little kid, but, I still remember the kind of stuff that was going on around me. It was an interesting time. So she said, "With our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country." Now, I'm not quite sure how you liberate a country by barbarically burning people to death. It's kind of like saying, with these stakes and pyres, we will burn these witches and liberate the country. It doesn't make any sense, but, that was the way they did it. But now, who were they burning to death, you might ask? And why were they burning people to death? And by the way, there were thousands of people burned to death. The sort of rough estimates is about 3,000 people were burned to death in a short period of time, but that's completely untraceable. People don't know how many. I'm sure it was a lot more. But let's talk about who they burned to death. First of all, they burnt to death other anti-apartheid groups. I mean, does that make a lot of sense to you? It doesn't make any sense to me, but the ANC, the Mkhonto Sizwe, were burning Inkatha Freedom Party members, the IFP, who is another group of mainly Zulus who were standing up. By the way, Mkhonto Sizwe is Xhosa, as I would say it, not Zulu. But so they were burning IFP members. There was another group called, what were they called? Going to find out here. I wrote it down. Okay, AZAPO, the Tanzanian People's Organization, the UDF, which is the United Democratic Front, and others. So other groups that were against apartheid, wanting to fight apartheid, they burned them to death. Doesn't make sense. Surely they're your friends, work together, enemy of my enemy is my friend, something like that, that whole thing. But no, they would also burn anyone that they suspected of collaborating with the state. Now, this is, of course, a slippery slope. If they just suspect that someone is informing the police, the apartheid police or government, or doing anything, as far as giving them intelligence or anything, they would burn them to death. But I don't know if you've ever seen mob mentality in action, because I have.
It's demonic,
and I was almost
scary.
murdered by a mob in South Africa at some point, and it's a story I'll tell. But this mob mentality thing, it sparks off for no reason.
Yeah.
I've seen a situation where they hear an accent and think it's a foreigner, because of the xenophobic attacks, and they threw stones and someone killed them. I've seen people get killed for nothing, being labeled a witch. They think someone's a witch in the townships and they'll bludgeon them to death and necklace them or whatever.
But yet, talking about witches, they've got Sagomas there, which is like a witch doctor, and they will go to them for everything. Every question that they need to find out, if they're not sure what to do, they will go there and find out stuff. And these witches make muti, and it's compounded of human flesh and parts of people and that. Yeah.
So, there's you basically just have to be in a place where someone's having a bad day and they think that you're collaborating with the government, and you'll get barbarically tortured and burned
Murdered.
to death. If you want to look this stuff up, feel free, but you'll have nightmares, so I'd suggest that you don't. But necklacing is next level cruelty. It's against the Geneva Convention. It's against every single humane society in the world, or just it's against humanity, really. So they used to necklace anyone they thought was working, and they used to necklace people that did actually work with the government. So black policemen, community councillors, because they used to have things like that. People that had jobs. It was a terrible time. And this is something that Mandela is 100% responsible for. He created this militant wing, the Mkhonto Isizwe, who used to run around necklacing people.
I've just actually realized something. Ramaphosa, he's so against crimes against humanity. Yeah, okay, it's you. It's you.
They used to take people that they thought were collaborators and put them in these little camps that they used to have out in the middle of nowhere and torture them by injuring them and denying them medical attention, denying them food. A lot of this stuff came out during something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which happened after apartheid, where basically it was a clean slate for bad people on both sides, where they were like, okay, tell us what you did, and we kind of wiped the slate clean, which was a terrible thing to hear what went on both sides, because of course the apartheid government was cruel and terrible too. But again, I'm just wanted to set the record straight here that Nelson Mandela was at his core a communist, and he used to hang out with Gaddafi and what's that Cuban guy? The guy with the cigars and the hat. It'll come to me. I'll put his picture up. You know what I'm talking about. Castro. Sorry, that was his name, Castro. He used to hang out with these guys. The people that used to hang out with him, who started in Mkhonto Isizwe, used to go train in the Soviet Union and China and all of this kind of stuff. And we're basically dealing with communists that wanted to put an end to capitalism and put an end to civilization, because that's usually what communists want. They want to tear things down. They never want to build things up, and they're incapable of doing so. So Nelson Mandela was a communist at his core. He used to be on the South African Communist Party Central Committee, and that was during his whole phase of creating Mkhonto Isizwe and all of this stuff. And he never left his communist roots behind. On top of that, he was a terrorist and was responsible for bombings of civilian targets. Even though he was in jail during the worst of it, when the civilians were being hit, he was still the head of it, and he still had the power to call an end to it and to stop it, but he never did. So after Mandela was released from prison, there was this hope and idea that things were going to level out and work out for everybody.
And us in South Africa, we actually were sold this whole rainbow nation thing. And so many white people thought that's going to be wonderful. And they started thinking, oh, Nelson is a great guy. Yeah. But there were some of us that knew it's just time. Because one thing about these Marxists and socialists and that kind, they've got time. It doesn't matter if it takes 10 years or 30 years. They've got time to actually sell ideas. But this whole building idea is one day. And then we've just got to first get rid of the white people or whatever, and then magically everything is just going to fall into place.
Body. This idea that, okay, now, black people will be able to integrate into society. Well, they had been, by the way, for a long time. It wasn't.
For a long time.
This is a myth. Mandela wasn't the person who ended apartheid. It was actually international pressure. It was the international community coming together and forcing the South African government through sanctions and all manner of other things to end apartheid, which is a good thing. I think it's a very good thing that it ended. It wasn't a good policy.
I just want to add in here as well that I know that I was in my 20s, in my early 20s, so it must have been about 1980, 81. I still remember going out one night to a restaurant, and there were black people there eating with us.
In the Nationalist Party, or the National Party that was running the government, wasn't a good government. They were very staunchly sort of conservative when I was growing up. All the TV shows were censored, and there was all kinds of censorship and other stuff going on. So, definitely not an ideal government or system. But like I said, that stuff had all been pretty much abolished. By the time I was, I'd say, 9 or 10 years old, apartheid wasn't even a thing anymore. Even though it hadn't officially, and Nelson Mandela hadn't officially taken over, things had already changed. I had black neighbors. My school was fully integrated with black people. Everything had changed. Everybody had the same opportunities. And so, we'd already reached that point by the time Mandela was released and took over the government. So anyway, he took over the government and everyone thought, "Way, this is great. This is amazing." But you know what? Nothing actually changed. You got a middle class of black people that came in, which was great, and that's something that we were all expecting and wanted to happen. But unfortunately, we got a system where it was all about nepotism and corruption, and so you got some very rich people suddenly out of nowhere who were basically just cadres or friends of Nelson Mandela. There was a pretty well-known case where one of his sort of higher-ups was being investigated for corruption, and the people that were trying to investigate his corruption, also his own in his party, were fired and kicked out. So, it was just about protecting your friends,
and
corruption,
some
that sort of
killed.
thing. He didn't actually make enough reform as far as the black community is concerned, and so a lot of the mines and banks that were supposed to be nationalized never got nationalized. So you had all these big corporations that managed to hold on to power and remain incredibly rich, while the majority of South Africa just kind of stayed middle class or became poor. And the most unfortunate part of this is that the poor people, the people that were hoping to benefit the most from the end of apartheid, actually are now far worse off in South Africa.
Yeah, they are far, far worse off. But they'll still vote for them. If it's not for the ANC, it will either be for the MK or old Julius Malema.
Poverty has increased an enormous amount. The unemployed statistics have just shot through the roof. And of course, you can see from the Mandela Magic clips that I've been throwing in here and there, just how much the country has fallen and how the infrastructure has fallen. So the country went to shit. The black populace that was supposed to benefit from apartheid falling didn't, in the long run, actually benefit at all, other than a few small elite in the middling middle class. The white people that were hoping for everything to be great and for the country and everybody to work together are in a position where they are seen as the architects of everyone's problems. You have a situation where nobody can live safely. Everyone has to live in a prison of their own making with barbed wire and electric fences. The power goes off all the time.
CCTV.
You have incredibly discriminatory government rules against white people, where it's almost impossible to get a job. If you're up against a black person, you can't win. And I can't remember the exact amount, but there's a lot of race-based laws that are against white people. So, to be a white person in South Africa is a big struggle at the moment, but also being a black person in South Africa is a big struggle at the moment. So nobody ended up winning. And yet everybody looks at Mandela as if he's some kind of hero. If I'm to be pragmatic about this, I can't blame Nelson Mandela for the downfall of South Africa. It's not fair to put so much on one man. But I also can't praise him for being some kind of a savior or a hero. Because he is a communist terrorist. He was a communist terrorist. And maybe a communist terrorist who mellowed a bit in his old age.
No.
I'm not trying to stoke any kind of animosity with this video. I simply want to share my experiences and let everybody out there know exactly why it is that I no longer live in the country of my birth and never plan to return. And also just to once again prove that communists suck and nothing good ever comes from communists. And that Joe Slovo guy is a piece of shit. And the Communist Party of South Africa is a piece of shit. And Umkhonto we Sizwe is a terrorist, disgusting guerrilla organization that targeted civilians and killed children and maimed and blew people up with landmines, tortured and burned people to death. So when you see Nelson Mandela, you can't just see this freedom fighter. You have to see a leader of a terrorist organization that did horrendous, unforgivable things too.
Right, so that was the first one. And the next one is a shorty about his wife. And this is something I still don't understand, how they still idolize their so-called heroes. This is about Winnie Mandela.
Mandela is a hero. She fought against apartheid, you see.
Tabiso Mono was one of the 3 boys kidnapped with Stompie by the Mandela United Football Club, a notoriously violent branch of the Soweto Youth Congress associated with Winnie.
Actually, she's the one that started the beating to all of us, and the rest followed for at least 1 hour, if not 2.
The fact that she fought against apartheid and the fact that she's black means Winnie Mandela.
That child, he was 14 years old, and Winnie had a so-called soccer club, and she would falsely accuse people of being spies for the National Party and that. And still, up until today, I cannot understand how you can murder and just walk off free.
Mandela does not get viewed as a murderer.
Economic freedom fighters celebrate the life of Winnie Mandela.
Although she committed a crime, she does not get viewed as a criminal. She got a 14-year-old murdered and she's still viewed as a hero. Winnie Mandela was found guilty and was sentenced for this crime, but her 6-year jail sentence was reduced to a fine and a 2-year suspended sentence.
And then you can understand why there is so much hurt and so many unresolved issues in South Africa. Right, that's it, people. See you next time.